It's now been almost a year since Russia invaded its neighbor in the west, Ukraine, and we have to start asking ourselves, what have the long-term effects been on the civil aviation industry? And in Russia, is flying in Russia even safe nowadays? There's been a lot of new developments to cover since we last looked at this topic, including some recent really worrying things, so stay tuned. We are very close to the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the human and material devastation that followed. Obviously, this war has far-reaching effects for the Ukrainian people, but like I've mentioned before when I've talked about this topic, I will concentrate on the effects of the invasion on the civil aviation industry, both in Ukraine, Russia, and also in the rest of the world. Starting with Ukraine itself, Antonov Airlines still continues to operate its fleet of Antonov 124s, apart from the two that are still in Ukraine. But if you are trying to find the other 5 jets using flight tracking websites, you will have some serious problems doing so, and this is most likely because the crews of those planes don't want to be tracked for obvious reasons, as they fly crucial supplies to support their country's war efforts. Getting the other 2 Antonov 124s out of Ukraine will be very difficult, even if any necessary repairs are completed, and that's because of the country's airspace still being closed. But aside from these jets, we also need to look at Ukrainian International Airlines, Ukraine's flag carrier. The company previously wet leased some aircraft to other European operators after the invasion, but this was mostly during the very busy summer season. Right now, all of the airline's aircraft are listed as inactive. Ukraine International Airlines still has about 11 aircraft stuck in Ukraine, with 4 others being abroad, but not surprisingly, the airline has returned 10 other aircraft back to its lessors since the invasion began. So, are all airliners that were inside of Ukraine when the invasion started stuck there? Well, it seems like at least one airliner was inside of Ukraine at the beginning of the war, but has since mysteriously managed to get out of there. And this is an Airbus A320 with registration Hotel Alpha Lima Whiskey Sierra, which was operated by Wizz Air, which is a European low-cost carrier. In the morning of the invasion, this Airbus was in Ukraine's Lviv International Airport. Lviv is only 35 nautical miles or so from the Ukrainian-Polish border, and on the 13th of September, at around 3 p.m. UTC, the aircraft casually crossed into Poland, flying at 10,000 feet. The crew flying the Airbus landed in Katowice airport about 40 minutes later, and the aircraft then spent some time out of use, likely undergoing checks after its unforced inaction, before returning to service about 1 month later. Wizz Air had 3 more A320s in Ukraine during the invasion. However, all of them were in Kiev, much further away from the border, so they are still stuck there. But looking a little bit further, in previous videos I have also said that the global aviation industry, which is usually the first to suffer from any global financial crisis, would likely not be that negatively affected by this conflict, given the rest of the shocks that it had suffered during the previous years. And it looks like this assumption seems to be holding up, but the invasion and the sanction have had some effects on the industry, including on the supply of aircraft engines. Raytheon, the parent company of engine maker Pratt & Whitney, said that transitioning out of Russia has been a limiting factor on its growth, most likely referring to the need to source key materials like titanium from alternate suppliers. But it's important to look at this in the right context. Even though the war and other factors made 2022 a quite challenging year for Raytheon, the company still grew its sales and backlog substantially. Other engine makers like General Electric are reporting similar growth, thanks to some really high demand. Russia's invasion was a factor in production delays, but the main issue was the timing of the invasion, which happened just after the pandemic. This meant that the industry as a whole went from very strong demand in 2019 to almost zero demand in 2020, with Russia's invasion and sanctions coming right at the point when everybody suddenly needed to bounce back as quickly as they possibly could. And that's likely a topic that may deserve its own video. But the most interesting and probably the most disturbing developments around the airline industry from this war involve Russia's own airlines and their future. And I will tell you all about that after this short message from my sponsor, who makes it possible for me to create these kind of videos. If you want to truly understand challenging subjects like computer science and maths, I highly recommend you to check out today's sponsor, Brilliant, possibly the best interactive learning platform out there. STEM skills are really important for navigating the modern world, whether you're trying to become a pilot or in just about any other walk of life. Brushing up my skills on Brilliant has actually helped me with things like my personal finances, career goals, and also understanding world-changing tech like AI or neural networks. Brilliant's visual and interactive approach is really engaging, and it makes STEM concepts actually stick in there, so you can level up in just 15 minutes a day with bite-sized lessons. Right now, I highly recommend their new course, Introduction to Algebra, which explore the twin pillars of the subject, equations and graphs. To get started for free, visit brilliant.org/mentor now or click on the link here in the video description. The first 200 of you who use this link will also get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription, so check it out. Thank you, Brilliant. Now back to the video. One of the really worrying trends that we saw when we previously looked at the effects of this war was that Russia's airlines were grounding some of their aircraft to use them for spares, basically to keep all of their other aircraft flying. There are now reports that this is happening at an increasing rate, and to allow this to happen, Rusavitsia, Russia's aviation regulator, is issuing approvals for this cannibalization of aircraft for an increasing variety of parts. The only condition Rusavitsia have put up, according to Aviation Week, is that these parts must have already gotten approval from one or of several foreign aviation authorities. There are already 24 different authorities in Rusavitsia's list, including the FAA, Europe's EASA and China's CAAC. There are also suggestions that Russia's airlines have already found alternative sources for aircraft parts abroad, which might be why they are now issuing approvals for as wide a range of other authorities as possible, basically to keep everyone guessing. And that's because those who would supply such parts to Russia are risking to become subject to sanctions themselves, obviously. Now, we'll get into those alternative sources and what they really mean in a minute, but first we must answer a key question. Is there actually anything wrong with this process? If a part that has been approved by the FAA or EASA to be used on a Boeing 737 or an Airbus A330, for example, why shouldn't they be able to be used there? Or would it matter if we cannibalize a non-active Airbus 330 for parts and use it on another Airbus 330? Well, the big issue here is that Russia's aviation regulator is allowing the country's airlines to make all of these swaps without getting approvals or even consulting either those foreign authorities or the manufacturer of the aircraft and the parts. And that's a really big deal, because such a part swap might be fine. Airlines around the world make such swaps in some circumstances almost all the time. But without consulting the proper channels, such a swap, even with original parts, can go terribly wrong. And if you want an example of that, you can look at the Air Transat Flight 236, which I made a video about over on the Mentour Pilot channel. You can check it out up here. In that example, the ground crew working on an engine's fuel system replaced a faulty part with a new one from the same manufacturer. But this was a newer and slightly different version of the faulty part, and to use it, it would be necessary to change more parts of the system to make it fit properly. After the maintenance crew had finished their work, everything looked just fine, but in flight, the result was a catastrophic fuel leak that, combined with some other factors, led to the aircraft running out of fuel and its pilots having to make the longest unpowered glide ever over the Atlantic Ocean. Another similar example was to an Interflight 1153 involving an ATR-72 turboprop. In this case, a ground crew was replacing a fuel gauge and mistakenly fitted one intended for the ATR-42 instead of the ATR-72. The ATR-42 is a shorter and smaller variant of the same aircraft with very different fuel tanks. Now, the new instrument fit fine, but it indicated that there was more fuel available than what was actually in there, so you can guess what that led to. These examples clearly show that using factory parts from other aircraft without consulting the proper channels is not a safe practice and can lead to some devastating mistakes. Again, these procedures are there for a reason. And the same philosophy is true for spares from other sources, even if the parts are genuine components from a reputable manufacturer. But according to Aviation Week, Russia's aviation authority is now going even further than this. Rusavitsia is reportedly allowing the country's airlines to install non-original spares on aircraft that are made outside of the country, which of course means the vast majority of all of the aircraft they have. Now, I sincerely hope that the term non-original spare part is perhaps something that was lost in translation and not a direct reference to spurious parts of unknown origin. But we do know that the Russian Aviation Authority has already allowed airlines to change parts and equipment in the cabin interiors, like seats and possibly galley equipment, with others available locally and from other sources. This started happening already last July of 2021, so the latest news could well be a sign that the Russian regulator is formalizing the process for using locally made parts in Russia's airline fleet, in a way that could eventually involve even more aircraft components. It's worth noting here when we talk about cabin interiors and especially passenger seats that a lot of research and hard work has gone into these passenger seats and also the rest of the cabin equipment. So replacing these parts with something that looks about the same but is far from a trivial matter and could have safety concerns. And then we come back to those parts that the airlines have found from alternative sources. That's quite worrying because historically, sourcing aircraft spare parts with a questionable history has been a sure way to get counterfeit and other dangerous parts fitted onto aircraft. To understand this, we have to look at the different types of unapproved aircraft parts and how difficult they can be to recognize. Many people assume that the term unapproved part is the same as counterfeit part, but outright fake parts are far from the only problem here. A lot of parts in aircraft are life limited and have to be replaced after a given amount of cycles or flight hours. There have been some cases where people have retrieved such parts either from service centers or from scrapped aircraft, cleaned them up and then repackaged them with fake paperwork to pass them off as if they were factory original parts. And that's not all. Sometimes genuine original equipment manufacturer or OEM parts might fail to meet the necessary specifications, either when they're new at the factory or after an approved refurbishment process. These parts should then be destroyed, but there have been cases where they somehow made it out onto other aircraft like repackaged time-expired parts. And since they once were perfectly legitimate, these time-expired or out-of-spec parts can be really hard to identify as unapproved aircraft components. Which is why sourcing parts directly from approved vendors with full transparency is so critically important. Opinions vary on the number of incidents and accidents that have been indirectly or directly caused by counterfeit or other unapproved parts, but one notorious example of this was Partner Flight 3904 back in 1989. That was involving a beautiful but old Convair CV580. The aircraft's vertical stabilizers separated in flight, causing the aircraft to crash with no survivors among the 55 people on board. A key factor in this accident were the bolts that were used to attach the vertical stabilizer to the fuselage. Most of them turned out to be counterfeits, which had been installed during maintenance some time before the accident, when the aircraft still belonged to a different airline. This tragedy highlighted the dangers of using those kind of parts, and it drove the FAA and other authorities to introduce safeguards that make tracking parts much more transparent. So by choosing alternative suppliers and by not consulting the manufacturers, Russian airlines might now start to lose out on these types of really important safeguards. So are there any good news for the Russian airlines then? Well, it depends a little bit on how you see it. The long-term goal of the Russian authorities is for Western aircraft designs to be replaced by Russian ones that don't depend on outside suppliers. And as part of this, last September, Aeroflot announced orders for 210 Irkut MC-21 aircraft, plus 89 Sukhoi Superjets and 40 Tupolev Tu-14s. Russia's goal, which they announced last summer, is that 80% of the airline fleet should be Russian-made by the year 2030. That's pretty ambitious, as it would require the production of over 1,000 new aircraft, big and small. So how have they been doing for the last few months? Well, other than announcing plans, including this worrying news about sourcing spare parts, we've heard very little from Russia about new aircraft production. But one interesting detail involves the first 4 prototypes of the Irkut MS-21 or the MC-21. These aircraft were fitted with American-made Pratt & Whitney geared turbofans, which obviously are no longer an option for them. So the manufacturer is now retrofitting these jets with Russian Aviad Vigatel PD-15 turbofans. But the MS-21 has only been certified with the Pratt & Whitneys and a lot of other Western equipment as well. Irkut originally made just one MS-21 with Russian engines, but the version of the aircraft with these engines isn't yet certified. Now, retrofitting more jets with the same engines should speed up the flight test program, but the problem for the Russians is that even the versions with the jet that has the Russian engines on it still is going to need a lot of foreign parts. These includes avionics, hydraulics, electrical systems, its fly-by-wire system, and even its cabin interior. And that's why a final fully Russified version of the MS-21 isn't expected until late 2024 or even early 2025. I personally wouldn't be surprised if that deadline is pushed back even further than that though. But there is at least one aircraft type in Russia's production plants that is already all Russian, and in theory at least already in production. And that's the Tupolev Tu-14, an aircraft roughly the size of a 757-200, which up until now only had orders from Russia's government and military. With a lack of spare parts for Boeing and Airbus aircraft, plus the need to re-engineer and replace the systems of existing Russian designs like the Superjet and the MS-21, you would think that Russia would have produced a few Tupolev Tu-14s for the country's airlines in the past year, wouldn't you? Because officially at least, this type was the interim solution to the country's need for a single-aisle aircraft to replace Western Airbus A320s and 737s. Russia's aviation industry has been quite vocal about their successes in the past few months, but there has been no word about any new-built Tupolev Tu-14s. Until the invasion a year ago, Tupolev was producing just 1 or 2 of these jets per year, and the jets simply aren't efficient enough to compete with Airbuses or Boeing, which is why the demand simply wasn't there before the invasion. Russia plans to invest $14.5 billion in its aviation industry, but in spite of this, it seems that, at least for the foreseeable future, Russia's airlines can only rely on whatever parts that they can find to try and patch together their existing jets. Finally, of course, we know that most of the Western aircraft that remained in Russia after the invasion belonged to foreign lessors. In total, foreign lessors lost about $10 billion worth of aircraft when Russia effectively stole them and kept them in Russia. Obviously, this was a shock for the aircraft leasing industry, which was already suffering the effects of the pandemic-era downturn. Currently, most of the lessors are locked in disputes with their insurance companies about compensations for these aircraft. But despite some early grim predictions, this did not bring a collapse in the aircraft leasing market. Although we could potentially see some more consolidations, and those, most of them at least, had actually already begun back in 2020, before the war. Interestingly though, despite the sanctions, some lessors in Ireland were able to transfer ownership of a small number of aircraft over to Aeroflot in January this year. These planes were already in Russia, and the details of these transactions are a bit unclear at the moment. But one key factor here is that after all of the changes that Russia's aviation regulator has made regarding spare parts and maintenance, lessors simply don't want these jets back anymore. Very few operators in other parts of the world would be interested in buying or leasing these jets after everything that's happened. But one consequence after losing so many aircraft and leasing revenue in Russia is that lessors everywhere have now said that they will be paying a lot more attention to geopolitics around the world before they agree to leasing contracts. They are not in a rush to exit any other markets, but they are definitely re-evaluating the risks of leasing aircraft in a variety of potential volatile markets, and that's something that could potentially work against airlines in poorer parts of the world where the politics are less stable. I will of course keep monitoring this and inform you if there are any major developments, but until then, check out this video, which I think you're going to find really interesting, or this playlist. If you want to support the work that we do here on the channel, please send a super thanks or join my Patreon crew using the link in the description below, or buy yourself some merch. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.